Dear Senator Hagerty, I write to you today from the city of Daejeon in the Republic of Korea with a heart full of hope and a spirit burdened by desperate urgency. My name is Kim Sun-gi, and I am a 49-year-old elder, known in our Methodist tradition as a Kwonsa, serving faithfully at Daejeon Jel Methodist Church. By day, I work as an operations support manager at a senior welfare center, caring for the elderly members of my community. By night and on weekends, I operate a small YouTube channel called Sun Patriotic TV, where approximately 7,200 subscribers join me in prayer and advocacy for the causes we hold dear. I am, by any measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, in a nation that has been blessed by its friendship with the United States of America for more than 7 decades. Yet today I write to you about something extraordinary, something that compels me to reach across the vast Pacific Ocean to seek your help. I write to you about Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon, a 69-year-old servant of God, who has dedicated more than 50 years of his life to ministry, who has led millions of Koreans in peaceful rallies celebrating the U.S. Korea Alliance and the trilateral cooperation between America, Korea, and Japan, that you yourself have championed, and who now languishes in a prison cell as I compose these words. As of today, March 19, 2026, Pastor Jun has been imprisoned for 66 days. His health is failing catastrophically. He can no longer walk without assistance. Most distressingly, he now requires a urinary catheter to empty his bladder because his body can no longer perform this basic function on its own. His spirit remains unbroken, but his body is deteriorating rapidly under conditions that are wholly inadequate for a man of his age and medical complexity. This letter you now hold in your hands is the 22nd international letter I have written to American leaders pleading for Pastor Jun's release. I have written to President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, Speaker Johnson, and numerous senators and representatives. Just 2 days ago, I sent my 21st letter to Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Today, I write to you, Senator Hagerty, because I believe that among all the members of the United States Senate, you possess a unique combination of qualifications that make you indispensable to this cause. You are the only sitting United States Senator who has served as ambassador to Japan. You spent 3 years living and working in Tokyo as a young businessman. You understand East Asia not from books or briefings but from personal experience. You know the people, the cultures, the politics, and the strategic importance of the region in a way that few of your colleagues can match. Senator Hagerty, I address you specifically because of your extraordinary experience as the 30th United States Ambassador to Japan. From July 2017 to July 2019, you represented the United States of America in one of its most important bilateral relationships. You lived in Tokyo, you worked with Japanese leaders at the highest levels, and you navigated the complex diplomatic landscape of Northeast Asia during a period of significant geopolitical tension. You witnessed firsthand the threats posed by North Korea's nuclear program, China's aggressive expansion in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, and the vital importance of maintaining strong alliances with democratic partners in the region. During your tenure as ambassador, you worked tirelessly to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance and to promote the trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea that is essential to regional security. You understood that these 3 democracies, bound together by shared values and common interests, form the backbone of the free world's presence in the Indo-Pacific. You negotiated trade agreements that benefited American farmers and workers. You advocated for increased Japanese defense spending and greater interoperability between American and Japanese military forces. You represented not just the American government but the American people, building relationships that continue to serve our national interests today. This experience makes you uniquely qualified to understand the situation I am bringing to your attention. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon is one of the most vocal and consistent advocates for the very trilateral cooperation that you championed as ambassador. For 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor Jun organized weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul, where participants waved American flags alongside Korean flags, sang hymns, prayed, and celebrated the alliance between our two nations. These were not mere political protests, they were worship services, held in public, expressions of gratitude for the friendship that has sustained Korean freedom and prosperity since the end of the Korean War. The core message of these rallies aligned perfectly with your own diplomatic priorities: support for the U.S. Korea alliance, opposition to communist aggression, defense of constitutional democracy, and protection of religious freedom. The cruel irony is that Pastor Jun is now imprisoned by a government that seeks to dismantle everything he stood for, and everything you worked to build as ambassador. The Lee Jae-myung administration is pursuing policies that would weaken the U.S. Korea alliance, distance Korea from Japan, and align the peninsula more closely with China. Pastor Jun's imprisonment is not incidental to this agenda, it is central to it. By silencing the most prominent voice for the alliance, the government hopes to clear the path for a fundamental reorientation of Korean foreign policy, away from the United States and toward accommodation with Beijing and Pyongyang. Senator Hagerty, your connection to East Asia extends far beyond your diplomatic service. Before you entered public life, you spent 3 formative years living and working in Tokyo as a young consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. This was not a brief assignment or a tourist experience. You immersed yourself in Japanese society, learned to navigate its business culture, and developed an understanding of Asia that has informed your entire career. You were the senior expatriate responsible for managing the firm's Western clients throughout the region, giving you exposure not just to Japan but to the broader Asian economic and political landscape. This personal experience gave you something that cannot be acquired from briefing books or policy papers: genuine cultural understanding. You know how Asian societies think about hierarchy, honor, relationships, and long-term strategic planning. You understand that the ties between nations are built not just on treaties and trade agreements but on personal connections and mutual respect. You learn to communicate across cultural boundaries, to read the subtle signals that Asian interlocutors often use in place of direct statements, and to build trust with partners whose backgrounds and assumptions differed profoundly from your own. When you later served as Tennessee's Commissioner of Economic and Community Development from 2011 to 2014, you put this understanding to practical use by attracting major Japanese investments to your state. Companies like Bridgestone Americas, Nissan North America, and Calsonic Kansei chose Tennessee, in part because of your ability to speak their language, literally and figuratively. You gave speeches in Japanese at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, demonstrating a level of commitment to cross-cultural engagement that impressed even seasoned diplomats. These investments created thousands of jobs for Tennessee workers and strengthened the economic ties between the United States and Japan. I mention this background because I want you to understand that my appeal is not coming from someone who views you as just another senator to be lobbied. I see you as someone who genuinely understands Korea and Japan, who has invested years of your life in building relationships in the region, and who cares deeply about the future of the Indo-Pacific. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon shares your commitment to the alliance, your appreciation for American leadership in Asia, and your belief that the democracies of the region must stand together against authoritarian aggression. He is your ally, your friend, and your partner in the cause you have championed throughout your career. And he is dying in a Korean prison while the world watches in silence. Senator Hagerty, just 2 days ago, on March 17, 2026, you appeared on Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business to discuss U.S. Japan cooperation and regional security. Your words during that interview are directly relevant to the case of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon. You spoke enthusiastically about the strength of the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, saying that it has never been stronger. You noted that the Chinese Communist Party does not like this cooperation, but that it makes a very strong statement in terms of the collaboration that we have. You emphasized that the technical cooperation from a national security and defense standpoint, as well as the economic cooperation, is strengthening ties throughout the region, and that it is good for America and good for our allies. I could not agree more with your assessment, Senator Hagerty. The trilateral cooperation you described is indeed vital to American interests in the Indo-Pacific. It is the foundation of regional security, the deterrent against Chinese and North Korean aggression, and the framework within which free nations can prosper together. But here is what I must bring to your attention. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon has been one of the most tireless advocates for exactly this trilateral cooperation. For 7 years, he rallied millions of Koreans to support the alliance with America and the partnership with Japan. He did so not from a position of political power, but from a position of moral conviction, using his platform as a religious leader to call his nation back to the values that have sustained Korean freedom. And now, Pastor Jun is imprisoned by a government that seeks to undermine the very cooperation you praised on national television. The Lee Jae-myung administration has made no secret of its desire to distance Korea from both the United States and Japan. Its policies would abolish the National Security Act that protects against North Korean infiltration, accelerate the transfer of wartime operational control in ways that could weaken military coordination, and potentially even request the withdrawal of the 28,500 American service members currently stationed on the peninsula. President Lee has publicly attacked religious leaders who speak on political issues, calling for them to be completely uprooted and comparing them to armed rebels committing treason. Senator Hagerty, you said in your interview that the Chinese Communist Party is quite disturbed by the strength of trilateral cooperation. I would submit to you that the CCP is not merely disturbed, it is actively working to undermine that cooperation, and the imprisonment of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon serves that objective. By silencing the most prominent Korean voice for the alliance, the Lee administration is doing the CCP's work for it. Every day that Pastor Jun remains in prison is a day that pro-American, pro-alliance voices in Korea are intimidated into silence. This is not just a human rights issue, it is a strategic issue that directly affects the interests you have spent your career defending. Senator Hagerty, your position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee gives you unique influence over American policy toward the Indo-Pacific region. You serve on subcommittees dealing with multilateral international development, international economic policy, and most importantly, you chair the subcommittee on State Department and USAID management, international operations, and bilateral international development. This role gives you direct oversight of the diplomatic apparatus that shapes American engagement with allies like Korea and Japan. The Foreign Relations Committee has historically played a crucial role in defending human rights and religious freedom around the world. It has held hearings on persecution in China, Iran, North Korea, and other authoritarian states. It has passed resolutions condemning abuses and calling for the release of political prisoners. It has used its platform to shine a spotlight on injustices that might otherwise go unnoticed by the American public and the international community. I am asking you to use your position on this committee to bring attention to the religious persecution now occurring in South Korea. This may seem surprising. South Korea has long been considered a model democracy, a success story of American foreign policy, and a beacon of freedom in Asia. But the situation has changed dramatically under the Lee Jae-myung administration. The arrest of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon on charges of incitement to insurrection was just the beginning. President Lee has publicly called for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He has compared pastors who engage in political speech to armed rebels. He has stated that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and must be completely uprooted. These are not the words of a democratic leader committed to religious freedom. These are the words of an authoritarian who views faith communities as threats to be neutralized. The presiding judge in Pastor Jun's case, Judge Park Ji-won, has openly criticized the prosecution's case as unclear and insufficient. At the hearing on February 27, 2026, Judge Park stated that the specific perpetrators of alleged crimes had not been identified, and that the prosecution had failed to establish how Pastor Jun's words led to any illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution to reconsider their indictment. Despite this judicial criticism, Pastor Jun remains imprisoned, a clear indication that his detention is driven by political considerations rather than legitimate legal concerns. The Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor Jun and Representative Shin Hae-sik due to insufficient evidence only after political pressure from above. Was Pastor Jun's warrant pushed through while Shin remained free? Senator Hagerty, your relationship with President Donald Trump is one of the closest and most trusted in the entire United States Senate. You served as the president's Tennessee Victory Chair during the 2016 campaign. After the election, you were selected as Director of Appointments for the Presidential Transition Team, personally overseeing the selection of nominees for cabinet positions and key government roles. President Trump trusted you so completely that he nominated you to represent the United States in Japan, one of America's most important diplomatic posts. When you decided to run for the Senate in 2020, the president endorsed you via Twitter before you had even officially announced your candidacy. This relationship has continued and deepened during President Trump's second term. You were reportedly under consideration for Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, or Secretary of State, positions that would have placed you at the very center of American economic and foreign policy. The fact that you were mentioned for all three demonstrates the breadth of the president's confidence in your abilities. You have access to the Oval Office that few legislators enjoy, and your counsel carries weight with the administration on matters of national importance. I raise this not to flatter you but to make a practical point. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon is one of President Trump's strongest supporters in all of South Korea. For years, Pastor Jun led rallies where participants celebrated not only the U.S. Korea alliance but the specific policies and leadership of President Trump. The participants viewed President Trump as a defender of freedom and a bulwark against communist aggression in Asia. They prayed for his success and celebrated his achievements. Pastor Jun himself has met with American senators, including Senator Lindsey Graham, to discuss the future of the Korean Peninsula and the policies needed to achieve peaceful reunification. The imprisonment of Pastor Jun is therefore not just an assault on religious freedom or on a Korean citizen. It is an insult to President Trump and to everyone who has supported the America First agenda in Asia. The Lee administration knows exactly what it is doing by targeting Korea's most prominent pro-Trump voice. I respectfully request that you consider sharing the situation of Pastor Jun with President Trump directly. A word from the president to Korean leadership could make an enormous difference. Your unique access to the president makes you one of the few people in America who could facilitate this intervention. Allow me to tell you about the man for whom I plead. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon was born on March 28, 1956, in a Korea that was still recovering from the devastation of war. He grew up in a nation that had been liberated from Japanese colonial rule by American soldiers, defended from communist aggression by American blood, and rebuilt with American aid and friendship. From his earliest days, Pastor Jun understood that the freedom he enjoyed was not free, that it had been purchased at tremendous cost by those who believed that liberty was worth defending. This understanding shaped his entire life and ministry. Pastor Jun answered God's call to ministry more than 50 years ago. He has spent his entire adult life preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, shepherding congregations, and calling his fellow Koreans to lives of faith, integrity, and service. He rose to become the senior pastor of Sarangjel Church, one of the largest and most influential Protestant congregations in Seoul. He served as the president of the Christian Council of Korea, the largest Protestant organization in the nation, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. He became a voice not just for his own congregation, but for the entire Korean Protestant community, speaking out on issues of national importance with courage and conviction. Beginning in 2019, Pastor Jun began organizing weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul. These gatherings brought together tens of thousands of Koreans who shared his commitment to faith, freedom, and the alliance with America. They would sing hymns, pray, recite the Lord's Prayer, and sing the Korean national anthem. They would wave Korean flags alongside American flags, celebrating the partnership that has been the cornerstone of Korean security and prosperity for 7 decades. For 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor Jun led these rallies without a single incident of violence initiated by himself or his followers. These were peaceful assemblies, exercises of the fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the Korean Constitution and by international human rights standards. The core messages of Pastor Jun's rallies aligned perfectly with American interests in the region's strong support for the U.S. Korea alliance, opposition to communism and its modern variants, defense of constitutional democracy, protection of religious freedom, and peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula through the spread of the gospel rather than through accommodation with the tyrannical regime in Pyongyang. These are values that every American administration, Republican or Democratic, has championed in its approach to the Korean peninsula. Pastor Jun was not a radical or an extremist. He was a conservative voice calling for the preservation of the values and relationships that have sustained Korean democracy. Yet despite this record of peaceful advocacy, Pastor Jun has been relentlessly persecuted by successive leftist governments in South Korea. Under the administration of President Moon Jae-in, which governed from 2017 to 2022, Pastor Jun was arrested and imprisoned 3 separate times. He was charged with an astonishing 76 criminal offenses ranging from election law violations to public safety infractions. The cases dragged on for years, consuming his time, his resources, and his energy. And in the end, after all the investigations, all the trials, and all the appeals, Pastor Jun was found not guilty on every single charge. All 76 accusations were dismissed by the courts as politically motivated, lacking in evidence, and fundamentally unjust. This pattern of persecution has now resumed with even greater intensity under the administration of President Lee Jae-myung. On January 13, 2026, Pastor Jun was arrested yet again, this time on charges of incitement to insurrection. These charges were designed to paint Pastor Jun as a dangerous radical seeking to overthrow the government, but they quickly collapsed under judicial scrutiny. There was no evidence of any plan to overthrow the government. There was no evidence of any violent conspiracy. There was no evidence of anything beyond a 69-year-old pastor exercising his constitutional right to speak freely about matters of public concern. The presiding judge, Judge Park Ji-won, has made clear his skepticism of the prosecution's case. At the hearing on February 27, 2026, Judge Park stated that the charges were unclear, that the specific perpetrators of alleged crimes had not been identified, and that the prosecution had failed to establish how Pastor Jun's words led to any specific illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution, in open court, that they should reconsider their indictment. This is an extraordinary rebuke from a sitting judge, a clear signal that the case against Pastor Jun is fundamentally flawed and that his continued detention cannot be justified on legal grounds. The selective nature of the prosecution is further evidence of political motivation. The Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor Jun and Representative Shin Hae-sik due to insufficient evidence. Only after political pressure from the highest levels of the Lee administration was the warrant for Pastor Jun alone pushed through, while Shin Hae-sik remained free. If the evidence against both individuals was insufficient to justify arrest, why was Pastor Jun singled out for detention? The answer is obvious. Pastor Jun is the more prominent figure, the more effective communicator, and the greater threat to the administration's agenda. His imprisonment is meant to silence not just him but everyone who shares his views. Senator Hagerty, I must speak to you now about a matter of life and death. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon is dying. His health conditions are severe, his access to adequate medical care is limited, and his continued detention is accelerating his decline at an alarming rate. If action is not taken soon, Pastor Jun may not survive to see his vindication in court. He may die in a Korean prison, a martyr to the cause of religious freedom and the U.S. Korea alliance. Pastor Jun suffers from a serious spinal condition called OPLL, which stands for ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. This is a progressive disease in which the ligament that runs along the back of the spine gradually turns to bone, compressing the spinal cord and causing severe neurological symptoms. Pastor Jun has undergone 3 separate cervical spine surgeries to address this condition. Metal screws and plates have been permanently implanted in his neck to stabilize his spine. This is not a condition that can be managed with simple medication. It requires ongoing monitoring by specialists, access to advanced medical facilities, and the ability to respond quickly if complications arise. In addition to his spinal condition, Pastor Jun has long-term diabetes with multiple serious complications. His heart function has deteriorated as a result of years of diabetes. He suffers from neurogenic bladder dysfunction, a condition in which nerve damage from diabetes has destroyed the bladder's ability to function properly. This means that Pastor Jun cannot urinate on his own. He now requires a urinary catheter, a tube inserted into his bladder, to drain urine from his body. This is a deeply invasive medical intervention that requires careful hygiene and monitoring to prevent life-threatening infections. In the conditions of a Korean detention facility, the risk of such infections is significantly elevated. Pastor Jun also suffers from peripheral neuropathy, which causes pain, numbness, and weakness in his extremities. He has hypothyroidism, requiring daily medication to maintain proper thyroid function. Since his imprisonment on January 13, 2026, he has lost significant weight due to stress and inadequate nutrition. He cannot walk properly without assistance. His legs have weakened to the point where he risks falling if he attempts to move on his own. He has been transferred to the medical ward of the detention facility, but even there, the care available is wholly inadequate for a patient with his complex medical needs. At his court hearing on February 27, 2026, Pastor Jun himself made a statement that should haunt everyone who hears it. He said that if the trial had been held on the originally scheduled date of March 20, he might have actually died. This is a 69-year-old man with a catheter in his bladder, metal in his spine, and multiple organ systems failing, warning the court that continued imprisonment may kill him. The next trial hearing is scheduled for April 17, 2026. That is less than 1 month away. If Pastor Jun remains in detention until that date, there is a real possibility that he will not survive. Senator Hagerty, I must now tell you about the man who is responsible for Pastor Jun's imprisonment. President Lee Jae-myung took office in 2025 after a tumultuous political period that saw the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. Lee represents the progressive left wing of Korean politics, a movement that has historically been skeptical of the U.S. Korea alliance, sympathetic to engagement with North Korea, and hostile to the influence of Protestant Christianity in Korean public life. His statements about religion since taking office should alarm every defender of religious freedom around the world. On January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor Jun's arrest, President Lee held his New Year press conference. His words about religion deserve to be quoted and analyzed carefully. President Lee declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. Consider those words, Senator Hagerty, the president of South Korea, a constitutional democracy and America's closest ally in the Indo-Pacific, announced that religious citizens who engage in political speech must be completely uprooted. This is not the language of democratic governance. This is the language of persecution. President Lee continued his attack on religious freedom with increasingly alarming rhetoric. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He said that using the religious system as a political tool is absolutely impermissible, comparing it to giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. This comparison of pastors to armed rebels is inflammatory and dangerous, creating a climate in which persecution of religious leaders can be justified as a matter of national security. President Lee then went further, calling for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He stated publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated and that the government should naturally proceed with investigations. This is religious targeting of the most blatant kind. The president of a democratic nation is calling for investigations into churches not because of any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but simply because they are Protestant churches that have engaged in political speech. Finally, President Lee used a chilling agricultural metaphor that reveals his strategic thinking. He said that when plowing a field, you remove the big stones first, then the small ones. Senator Hagerty, Pastor Jun is the big stone. By removing him, the administration sends a message to every other religious leader in Korea: if you speak out, you will be next. Senator Hagerty, the persecution of Pastor Jun cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern of policies that directly threaten the trilateral cooperation you praised in your recent television interview. The Lee administration is pursuing what Pastor Jun has called the 5 major policies, each of which would fundamentally undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and the regional security architecture you worked so hard to strengthen during your time as ambassador. The first policy is the abolition of the National Security Act. This law has been the foundation of South Korea's defense against North Korean infiltration and espionage since the early days of the Republic. It provides legal tools for identifying and prosecuting North Korean agents, for preventing the spread of pro-North Korean propaganda, and for protecting the constitutional order against subversion. The Lee administration wants to abolish this law entirely, removing critical protections against North Korean intelligence operations at a time when the threat from Pyongyang remains as serious as ever. The second policy is the early transfer of wartime operational control. Under current arrangements, in the event of war on the Korean peninsula, operational control of combined U.S. and Korean forces would transfer to a combined command structure led by an American general. This arrangement ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean forces and leverages America's superior military capabilities. The Lee administration is pushing to accelerate the transfer of this control to Korean command, without ensuring that Korean forces are fully prepared to assume this responsibility, potentially creating dangerous gaps in military coordination. The third policy is the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea. Approximately 28,500 American service members are currently stationed in South Korea, a tangible commitment to collective defense that has deterred North Korean aggression for decades. The Lee administration has actively discussed the possibility of requesting the withdrawal of these forces, a move that would fundamentally alter the security landscape of Northeast Asia and embolden both Pyongyang and Beijing. The fourth policy is the dissolution of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. This command structure, established in 1978, ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean military forces. It is the institutional embodiment of the alliance, the framework through which joint planning, joint training, and joint operations are conducted. Its dissolution would sever the operational links between the two militaries that you worked to strengthen as ambassador. The fifth policy is the abolition of the Defense Counterintelligence Command. This agency is responsible for protecting South Korea from espionage, sabotage, and other forms of foreign interference. Its abolition would leave South Korea vulnerable to penetration by North Korean and Chinese intelligence services, compromising not only Korean security but also American military secrets shared with Korean allies. Senator Hagerty, you may understand better than almost anyone in the United States Senate why the imprisonment of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon matters to American interests. Your experience as ambassador to Japan, your years of living and working in Tokyo, your service on the Foreign Relations Committee, and your close relationship with President Trump have given you a perspective on Indo-Pacific security that is both deep and practical. Allow me to connect the dots and explain why this case should command your personal attention. First, the trilateral cooperation you praised on Fox Business depends on strong, pro-alliance voices in all three countries. In Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba has committed to increased defense spending and closer coordination with the United States. In Korea, however, the situation is deteriorating. Pastor Jun was one of the strongest pro-alliance voices in Korean civil society. His imprisonment sends a chilling message to everyone else who might speak up for the relationship with America. When pro-American voices are silenced, anti-American voices grow louder, and the political space for cooperation shrinks. Second, the Chinese Communist Party benefits directly from the persecution of Pastor Jun. You noted in your interview that the CCP is quite disturbed by the strength of trilateral cooperation. But the CCP is not merely disturbed, it is actively working to undermine that cooperation through influence operations, economic pressure, and support for political forces that favor accommodation with Beijing. The Lee administration's policies align remarkably well with Chinese strategic objectives: weaken the alliance with America, drive a wedge between Korea and Japan, remove American troops from the peninsula, and neutralize voices that call for resistance to Chinese hegemony. Pastor Jun's imprisonment advances every one of these objectives. Third, religious freedom is a cornerstone of American foreign policy, and its violation by an ally undermines American credibility worldwide. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 established religious freedom as a core foreign policy priority. When a close American ally like South Korea begins persecuting religious leaders for their political speech, it sends a message to authoritarian regimes everywhere that they can do the same without consequences. If America remains silent when persecution occurs in a democracy, how can we credibly demand better behavior from autocracies? Fourth, Tennessee's economic interests are connected to Korea through the Japanese investments you helped attract. Companies like Nissan and Bridgestone, which have major operations in Tennessee, depend on stable supply chains and business relationships throughout Asia. The security of the Korean peninsula directly affects these companies and the thousands of Tennessee workers they employ. A weakened alliance and an emboldened North Korea would create uncertainty throughout the region, potentially disrupting the economic ties that benefit your constituents. Senator Hagerty, I come to you not merely with a problem but with specific requests for action. I ask you to consider the following steps, each of which is within your power, and each of which would make a meaningful difference in the fight for Pastor Jun's freedom and for the values we share. First, I request that you issue a public statement expressing concern about religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jun's immediate release. A statement from a United States Senator who served as ambassador to Japan and who chairs a key foreign relations subcommittee carries enormous weight. It signals to the Korean government that the international community is watching, and that the treatment of Pastor Jun will have consequences for Korea's reputation and relationships. Your statement would be reported in Korean media and would encourage other leaders to speak out. Second, I request that you consider requesting a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the state of religious freedom in South Korea. Such a hearing would provide a platform for testimony about the persecution of Pastor Jun and other religious leaders, would generate media attention that the Korean government cannot ignore. and would place the issue squarely on the agenda of American foreign policy. Your position as chair of a key subcommittee gives you the standing to make such a request. Third, I request that you work with your colleagues to consider a Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea and calling for the release of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon. Such a resolution would be a powerful statement of American values, and would put the Korean government on notice that its behavior is unacceptable to the United States Congress. Fourth, I request that you share the situation of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon with President Trump. Your unique relationship with the president, dating back to your service on his transition team, and continuing through your tenure as ambassador and senator, gives you access that few others possess. Pastor Jun is one of President Trump's strongest supporters in Korea. His imprisonment is an insult to the president and to everyone who has championed the America First agenda in Asia. A word from the president could make an enormous difference. Fifth, I request that you contact Secretary of State Marco Rubio to discuss the situation in South Korea. As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, you have direct access to the Secretary. Secretary Rubio, as the son of Cuban immigrants who fled communist tyranny, understands persecution in a deeply personal way. A conversation between you and Secretary Rubio could help ensure that religious freedom in Korea becomes a priority for the State Department. Sixth, I humbly request that if it is ever possible, you might help facilitate an opportunity for me to brief members of Congress or the State Department directly on the situation in Korea. I have been documenting this crisis for months, writing letters, gathering evidence, and building relationships with supporters around the world. I would welcome the opportunity to share what I have learned with American policymakers who can make a difference. Senator Hagerty, I close this letter with a personal appeal from one person of faith to another. You have identified yourself as an Episcopalian and as a conservative Christian who was raised with strong religious values that you have passed on to your 4 children. You understand that faith is not merely a private matter but a foundation for public engagement, a source of moral guidance that informs how we treat our neighbors and how we organize our societies. You have supported religious freedom not as an abstract principle, but as a lived commitment, standing with President Trump against those who would restrict the ability of Americans to speak about their faith and values. Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon shares your commitment to faith as the foundation of public life. He has spent 50 years preaching the gospel, not just within the walls of the church but in the public square, calling his nation to repentance and renewal. He believes, as you do, that religious voices have a legitimate and necessary role in political discourse, that people of faith should not be silent when their nations face moral challenges. For this belief, he is now suffering in a prison cell, his body failing, his freedom stolen, his voice silenced. The Bible teaches us in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Pastor Jun cannot speak for himself from his prison cell. He cannot advocate for his own release. He cannot tell his story to the world. But you can speak for him. You have the voice, the platform, the relationships, and the position to make a difference. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 36, records the words of Jesus, I was in prison and you came to visit me. And when the righteous ask when they saw the Lord in prison, he answers, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Pastor Jun is in prison for his faith and for his defense of the alliance between America and Korea. Visiting him, speaking for him, fighting for his release, this is the work of faith put into action. This is what it means to follow Christ, not just in word but in deed. I am just an ordinary man. I work at a senior welfare center in a mid-sized Korean city. I earn a modest salary. I have no political power, no great wealth, no famous name. What I have is a keyboard, an internet connection, and an unshakable conviction that right will ultimately prevail. I have written 22 letters to American leaders. because I believe that somewhere, somehow, one of these letters will reach a person who can make a difference. I believe that you, Senator Hagerty, with your deep knowledge of Asia, your relationship with President Trump, your position on the Foreign Relations Committee, and your commitment to religious freedom, may be that person. Thank you, Senator Hagerty, for taking the time to read this letter. I know that you receive countless communications from constituents and advocates around the world, and I am deeply grateful that you have given this appeal your attention. I pray that God will guide your decisions and that He will use you as an instrument of justice and mercy in this desperate situation. Pastor Jun, in his prison letter, reminded his followers of President Syngman Rhee's rallying cry: "Unite, fight, win." These words sustained the Korean people through the darkest days of their history. From Japanese occupation through communist invasion through decades of authoritarian rule, they can sustain us now. I ask you to unite with us in this cause, to fight for religious freedom and the trilateral cooperation you have championed, and to help us win the release of Pastor Jun Kwang-hoon before it is too late. I pray for Pastor Jun, that God will sustain his failing body, strengthen his unbroken spirit, and bring about his swift release before his health deteriorates beyond recovery. I pray for the people of South Korea, that they will find the courage to resist the forces of authoritarianism, and to defend the freedoms that so many sacrificed to secure. I pray for the trilateral cooperation between the United States, Korea, and Japan, that the alliance you worked so hard to strengthen will endure this test and emerge even stronger. And I pray for you, Senator Hagerty, that you will be blessed in your service to Tennessee, and to the nation, that your family will prosper, and that you will always have the wisdom to know what is right and the courage to do it. You have dedicated your career to strengthening the bonds between America and Asia. I ask you now to stand for a man who has dedicated his life to the same cause, who is paying the ultimate price for his courage, and who may not survive much longer without intervention from those who have the power to help. With deepest respect and urgent hope, I remain your humble servant in Christ, Kim Sun-gi.